Hello, this is Tony Heller from RealClimateScience.com, setting the record straight about climate. I'm going to show you some graphs from government agencies today which bear no resemblance to reality. The only way which these graphs from different government agencies could have become so similar is if they colluded. Let's take a look at some graphs now. Zeke Housefather from Berkeley Earth made these claims earlier this week. He said, while all of these three graphs from NASA show a relatively flat period of temperatures from 1940 to 1960, none show dramatic declines evident in early Northern Hemisphere-focused land records. This is because modest mid-century cooling is only found in the Northern Hemisphere higher latitude regions. So what Zeke is trying to do here is make the post-1940s global cooling and the Ice Age scare disappear. Zeke is trying to erase the unanimous consensus of scientists in the 1960s and the 1970s. There was never any question among scientists that the 1960s through the mid-1970s were cooling. There was disagreement about what the future held. Some believed in global cooling and others believed in global warming, but nobody doubted that Earth was cooling rather quickly. Zeke and his cohorts in data tampering are banking on the fact that few people remember what was going on 40 years ago. I throw a monkey wrench in their works by bringing up history. But to be fair to them, there is another possibility. These young people who are doing the data tampering may simply not know history, and they may not be aware of how fraudulent their data practices are. So that's what I'm doing. I'm educating people about history. And I'm also educating people about how fraudulent these graphs from government agencies are. Let's go on to Zeke's next graph now. Multiple different groups of researchers around the world, including NASA, NOAA, the UK Met Office, and Berkeley Earth, have all put together historical temperature reconstructions that all agree quite well with each other and with raw, uncorrected records. Now I'm going to show you that these claims are false and that the only way these graphs could agree so closely is if they colluded. Let's go back to Zeke's first graph for a minute. The bottom graph is the southern extratropics. This graph shows fairly steady warming from 1930 until the present. But in 1978, NOAA showed the exact opposite. This equivalent graph from NOAA in 1978 showed very strong cooling from the 1950s into the mid-1970s. The text reads, the decreasing temperature in the south extratropics amounts to about 0.8 degrees Celsius. So it's pretty clear that government agencies don't agree. NOAA 1978 says the exact opposite of NOAA 2019. Who's more likely to understand better what the climate of the 1970s was, the scientists who were working then or the young hacks who are tampering with the data now? I'm going to go with Angel and Korshover, two of the most respected names in climate science. Now let's look at the data from the Southern Hemisphere. There's only one place in the Southern Hemisphere which has good long-term data, and that's Australia. There are 20 locations in Australia which have good long-term temperature data going back to the 1880s. They are marked on this map. So what I did was I averaged out the temperatures at these 20 long-term locations. And remember, this is the only place where we have long-term data in the Southern Hemisphere. And look what I found. Temperatures in Australia dropped sharply from the early part of the 20th century into the mid-1970s. This sharp temperature drop from the 1940s to the 1970s is exactly the same thing as we see in the Northern Hemisphere. Zeke's claim that this cooling doesn't exist is simply nonsense. If you remember from yesterday's video, what people like Zeke are doing is throwing in all kinds of really low-quality temperature records which simply create noise. But if we use only high-quality data, the 1940 to 1970s cooling is very obvious, it's very real, and it's the same as in the Northern Hemisphere. Now let's look at the percent of hot days in Australia. As you can see, summers in Australia used to be much hotter back in the 19th century, and that the number of hot days declined sharply in Australia from the late 19th century into the mid-1970s. So the 1970s Ice Age scare was very real and it was global, and Zeke is not going to be able to erase it. However, the Australian Bureau of Meteorology is trying to do just that. This is their completely fake temperature graph for Australia. They hide all of the hot weather prior to 1910, and they use a lot of very poor data practices to create this cool weather prior to the year 1970. If they used only high-quality stations, their graph would look much more like mine. Now let's look at some of Australia's hot past, from the years which the Australian Bureau of Meteorology is now hiding. January of 1896 was the hottest month on record in southeast Australia. The average afternoon temperature that month at Bourke, New South Wales was 110 degrees Fahrenheit or 43 degrees Celsius. Let's look at some newspaper articles from January 1896. Barrier Minor, Thursday evening, January 23, 1896. Alarming sickness in many towns. The position at Bourke. Yesterday's maximum heat record in the shade was 121 degrees. In many shops, the register was 125. The business places except the hotels are closed. 10 more deaths have occurred in the town and district. The hospital is overcrowded. A bad time in Queensland. High records, numerous deaths, and blasted crops. January 9, 1896. The Sydney Morning Herald. Bushfires raging. Amongst the remarkable readings are Bourke and Brewarina, 117 degrees, Walgett, 116 again. In all, there were 44 stations out of 100 reporting that they had shade temperature exceeding 100 degrees. Another article from the Sydney Morning Herald, January 24, 1896, reporting temperatures of 120 degrees. New York Times, hottest of hot waves on record, how it struck sweltering New South Wales in January last. Talking about hot weather, one day last January, the mercury to Adelaide, Australia marked 127 degrees in the shade. And if you look at the bottom of the article, you can see shade temperatures along the Darling River on successive days in January 1896. 112, 107, 112, 114, 118, 121, 123, 118, 118, 115, 117, 124, 117, 121, 120, 128, 128, 124, 129, 126, 120, 126, 129, 110, and 108 degrees. That's some incredibly hot weather reported in the New York Times. And New York was having their own heat wave. This was reported on NPR. The heat wave of 1896 and the rise of Roosevelt. During the summer of 1896, a 10-day heat wave killed nearly 1,500 people, many of them tenement dwellers across New York City. Europe was also having a terrible heat wave that summer. July 17, 1896, heat wave in Europe, deaths from sunstroke. A great heat wave is at present being experienced in Europe. In England, numerous deaths by sunstrokes have occurred, including that of a sentry on duty at Marlborough House, the London residence of the Prince of Wales. In Spain, the heat has been so intense that the very birds have been killed. Arizona also had their record heat wave in 1896. Parker, Arizona had 7 consecutive days over 120 degrees, a record which has only been matched again once in 1905. There was a worldwide heat wave in 1896. If the person at the Bureau of Meteorology who made this graph was an actual scientist rather than a propagandist, they would have wanted people to know about the heat of 1896 rather than hiding it from the public. When I bring up this historical information, I get attacked by climate scientists like Richard Betts at the Met Office in the UK. He doesn't dispute anything that I say and simply relies on personal attacks. There's nothing new about hiding or tampering with climate data. This is an interesting article from the January 1907 Monthly Weather Review. Is not honesty the wisest policy? It is wrong to mutilate or suppress the record of an observation of a phenomenon of nature, but it is also wrong to make a bad use of the record. In fact, it is the misuse of meteorological data, not the observing or publishing, that constitutes a crime against the community. So what I'm doing is I'm observing and publishing the actual data. What they're doing is mutilating and suppressing it. What they are doing is a crime against the community. Then the article goes on. Observation and careful research are to be encouraged as useful. Misrepresentations are to be avoided as harmful. The independent press, as the voice of the people, should be not only vox populi, but vox dei, repressing all cheats and hoaxes, defending the truth in the best interests of the whole nation as against the self-interest of a few. The only independent press we have now in this country are bloggers like myself and Anthony Watts. And I'm fighting against these people at government agencies who are mutilating and suppressing temperature records. Before I finish up, Zeke will try to claim that the reason his southern hemisphere data is different from mine is because he's using ocean data as well. But the ocean data is also fake, as shown in this ClimateGate email from Phil Jones. Phil Jones said, for much of the southern hemisphere between 40 and 60 south, the ocean temperature normals are mostly made up, as there's very little ship data there. The 1970s Ice Age scare was very real and it's global. The great American physicist and Nobel laureate Richard Feynman said, reality must take precedence over public relations, for nature cannot be fooled. Alarmists may have billions of dollars and a propaganda machine backing them up, but nature cannot be fooled. The reason why the graphs Zeke was showing from different government agencies were all so similar is because they colluded to make them that way. I show this ClimateGate email all the time because it's critically important. From Tom Wigley at NCAR to Phil Jones at the University of East Anglia, copying Ben Santer at Lawrence Livermore National Laboratories. If we could reduce the ocean blip by say 0.15 degrees Celsius, then this would be significant for the global mean, but we still have to explain the land blip. It would be good to remove at least part of the 1940s blip, but we're still left with why the blip. The scientists openly colluded to create a common temperature graph, with the warmth of the 1940s removed and the subsequent global cooling removed. These graphs don't accurately represent Earth's temperature record, and the only reason why they're so close together is because the government agencies who created them colluded to make them that way. What they're doing is not science. They are mutilating and suppressing records. It's a crime against the community. Visit Toto on the web at realclimatescience.com. He's been pulling back the curtain on junk science and propaganda for a long time.